Hi, my name's Laura and I'm a blogger for Formby. In a previous tutorial I showed you how to draft a collar. Today I'm going to show you how to sew it up. So what you need for this tutorial is you need your pattern pieces, and I've got mine laid out here. You need pins and a pair of embroidery scissors and also your sewing machine. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to pin up our collar. As you can see from my pattern pieces, I've got my front parts of the collar, so they're the bits that go around here, the front, the top of it, and then I've also got the backs. The backs are in two pieces, so the first thing I'm going to need to do is sew them together. So I just put them together like this and then pin them up, and I'll get them sewn up. So as you can see, they're pinned together like this so that I can sew them together. I've now sewn together those seams to make the pieces match up with the top pieces like that. As you can see, I stitched them at that seam allowance which we previously made 1 centimetre in the drafting tutorial, and I've also pressed the seams flat together like that. The reason that you do that is because that helps to push the fabric into the shape of that seam so that it sits perfectly on the seam. If you can use steam on your fabric, do, because that will help shape the fabric into this pressed shape. But if you're not sure if your fabric can take steam, test a piece before you do that, because you don't want to ruin your piece. Okay, now what we need to do is we need to match up the top and the bottom of each collar piece. So you do this, but you make sure that it's inside out. So what I mean by that is the seam that you've just made, if you have done this like me and made these two separate pieces originally, if you've got this seam, make sure that this is on the outside, on the top. Like that, so that's lying underneath that piece. Equally, if you've got fabric that's got a wrong and a right side, then make sure that the right sides are touching each other so that you've got what will be the inside of your collar on the outside. And then what you need to do is you need to pin all along these outside bits here. One way that I find it helpful to match it up is to start at the corners. So I just pin all the corners in place first. And then take the middle of the longest bit here and pin in the middle here. And then the best way I find to pin, just to make sure everything's evenly spread over, is to find the middle each time in the piece that you're pinning. So for example on this, find the middle of these two pins and pin there. And repeat that process until you're happy with how many pins you've got in your piece and you feel comfortable that you'll be able to sew it like that. The other thing to note about the way that I pin is I pin adjacent to the edge of the seam, because that means I can run my sewing machine along my pins and I don't have to remove them. Okay, so that's one pinned up. So now I'm just going to do the other. The other thing, just to make sure, which I probably should have said earlier, is just make sure that you're making opposites to each other, so that when you pin them together they're actually opposites, because you want to make sure that you've got a collar for each side. Now we've got our two collar sides pinned up, I'm going to sew them together. So I'm going to sew along these 3 lines, leaving the inside unstitched. I'm going to do that at my 1 centimetre seam allowance, and you need to do that whatever seam allowance you've given your collar. So I'll do that now. So I've now sewn together my pieces. You can see them like that, where they're sewn all along these 3 edges here. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to trim the edges a bit. You can just trim the corners, which I'll show you how you need to do that in a second, or you can trim the whole edge like I'm going to do, and I'll tell you why I do that as well. But basically, to trim the corners, first of all, I didn't say at the beginning, but you need fabric scissors and or pinking shears as well. So let's grab my fabric scissors and my pinking shears. Always good to be prepared. So for the corners, you need to make sure that the point of your collar is pointed when you fold it over. So what you need to do is you actually need to remove this excess fabric around the excess fabric around the seam on the corner. So what you do is you cut it out as close as you can to the stitch that you've just made. You cut the corner. Like that. So you've got the seam going right up to here, and I've just cut these corner pieces off. And what you'll see is when we fold this the right way around, you will be able to push out that corner a lot more than you would have been able to if you didn't do that. So do that on all the corners. And also, the sharper the corner, the more fabric you're going to need to take away from further down, because this bit of fabric that you inside the stitch, if you can see here, that's got to contain all of the excess fabric. So the narrower that is, the less fabric you can have around it. So just be careful not to cut into the stitch at all. But yeah, take away as much as you feel comfortable doing. So I'll just do that to the other one. There we go. So now the other thing that I do, and actually having thought about it a little bit more, I would strongly recommend doing it anyway, is I'm going to take off more of this seam allowance all the way around. But it's especially important, seeing as this piece is a curved edge here, to try and remove some of that fabric, because if you look at it, there's actually more fabric on this side of the stitch than there is on the inside of the stitch. So when you fold it over, that will become bulky. So if you can remove that, you can do that one of 2 ways. You can either cut notches into the seam allowance with normal fabric scissors. As long as you obviously don't cut into the stitch, you can just cut little triangular notches out. Or you can do what I'm going to do, which is use pinking shears, because it's a little bit quicker and it will essentially help do that anyway. So I just use a pair of pinking shears. And I'm actually just going to do it on these edges as well, because to me I think it's nice to just try and get rid of as much of that fabric as possible, because it's only going to add bulk inside the collar. And then you need to do that to your other one as well. Okay, so now that we have cut the edges of our 2 pieces, we're now going to turn them over and press them into place. So we're actually going to put them the right way around. And then we're going to pop the corners out, and the best way of doing that is use your hands as much as possible just to get them out, and then you'll find you've got this little bit in the corner that you need to get out. So I always use embroidery scissors because they're nice and small, but they're actually not going to ruin the fabric, and I just slowly push through with the embroidery scissors until I'm happy. You can also just sort of twist it so you get your point out. Ooh, Yeah, twist in shape so you get your point out there. Just do it again with this one. So what you do is take your embroidery scissors and then you just start pushing through. Until you're happy with how it's come out. So now we're going to iron and basically press this. So what you do is you need to just roll the fabric into that seam and then get your iron it down, and then if you can with your fabric use the steam. You can already see the difference that's made, so like in that corner compared to the other ones, or on that side, sorry, compared to the other ones, you can see how much more flat that is. So, and I just find gently rolling that edge can help you to get the seam right into the centre sometimes. And I normally iron it into place and then I steam it, just so that I don't steam it in the wrong place. And I'll just iron up the rest of that. And there we go. There's our nice and flat collar done. So I'll just do the other one. Okay, so now we have our two pieces like that. Other tutorials might suggest to you doing a understitch along the underside of it to force that seam to roll to the back, which you can do, but I don't like to do it because I think it warps the shape of the whole collar just slightly, and I prefer not to. So if you did want to just ensure that your seam always rolls towards the back, you can open this up and then literally run a stitch all the way down the piece that will be the bottom of the collar, really close to the seam. But I think it's really tricky to do, and also I don't like the way it warps the collar out of shape. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pin these into place straight onto my garment, which I'll show you now. So this is the garment, and this is the neckline of my garment. If you remember from my drafting tutorial, I mentioned to you before that I'm doing a pattern which has a button fastening running all the way down the back. So that is the centre point of the front, and that will be the edges each time. So what you need to do is have your garment inside out, and then place your collar along the neckline. Place your collar along the neckline with the piece that's the bottom facing up. And the reason you do that is because we're going to stitch a seam, and then we're going to stitch a seam along it, and then we will be folding that collar over to the front side. So you take the outside of the garment, the inside of the garment, and you pin the collar onto it with the underside of the collar facing you. It's really important that you place the collar into the right place on the garment. So what you need to do is find the centre point, and then make sure that how do I explain this? You find the centre point of the collar, but now you need to remember that there's going to be a 1 centimetre seam allowance, which means that when you take your second piece there'll be a slight overlap between the two pieces, so that actually when you do that seam allowance it meets right in the centre of them, so when you fold it over they lie perfectly together. So what you need to do is think about that 1 centimetre and make sure that you overlap them so that they differ at that 1 centimetre seam allowance. That's where they where they cross, even. That's the right word, where they cross. So now I'm going to pin the first one on. And once you've worked that out, the rest of it is a lot simpler. But it's just good. It's good to think about it as in what that means. Okay, so you can see at this point, at the edge here, you've got it overlapping, ready for that seam, and at the end, now I don't know if you saw my fussing around, but I was finding that they weren't overlapping a centimetre, so when I stitch my seam, I need to make sure that my seam passes through that crossover point right there, because by doing that, when I fold it over, then the two collars and triangles will meet exactly at the seam, and that will look really neat. So now we're going to stitch up. Okay, so now I have sewn all the way along the neckline. You can see on these corners here how I've made sure that that stitch goes right into that corner, and also on this centerpiece here you can see what I was saying about exactly where they overlap. At the point where they overlap, that's the point that the seam has to go through. The other thing to note about my design is I've got a slight natural point in the neckline, which meant that when I was stitching I rotated the line, I rotated the needle to make that point right on the point where these two cross. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we are going to flip them over the right way and press, but before we do that we want to neaten up this raw edge here and get it ready so that when we flip it over and press we don't have any bulging bits. So in the same way that when we made the edge for the rounded edge of that collar, where we took away bits so that we can fold it over and there's no excess fabric, we're going to do the same to this neckline here. So I use pinking shears because I think it's just easier and quicker to cut all the way along with pinking shears, but if you don't have pinking shears, again just use your scissors and cut out little triangle notches along the way just to reduce the bulk of this down. So I'll do that now. The edge has been cut all the way along. So what we're going to do is we're going to fold the collar over and turn the garment the right way around so it's no longer inside out. Now you can see the collar it's almost done, it's almost secured in the right place, like that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to press this collar down. So I'll do that now. I'm going to be honest, it can get a bit fiddly, but we should be fine. So fold the collar and then just make sure that you get this seam right on the right in the centre of the fold, and then iron in place, and if you can, steam it down. The other thing that I need to do, actually, I forgot to say and I've got to do, is because I've got a slight point, a slight V shape in my collar, I need to slash that, slash the fabric into that fold, into that corner, so that I can fold the fabric round, as so. Okay, so now we have ironed and pressed that collar into the right place on the garment, like that. So some people, you'll see on this point here and also on the ends, you'll see that the seam allowance underneath is poking through. So some people would just trim that and then have that done as their collar. But ever the perfectionist, I'm not happy with the fact that if you folded that over you could see that raw edge, and I don't think that it will last as long. I think it will wear down. So what I do is I'm going to do a top stitch that conceals this raw edge inside. So that's also why I've cut it quite close with my pinking shears, so that I can do that. So what I do is, it's pretty much in place to just pin it and hold them in place, but I keep these edges on the corners slightly longer so that I can fold them under and catch them with a stitch. And then I just not very good. Okay. It can be quite fiddly, and sometimes you can't do it. Sometimes the best thing to do is just to trim it, but if you can catch it underneath, I think it's just neater. And then what I'll do is I'll just add a few pins running along the top, just to make sure that when I sew nothing slips out of place. And then I'm going to do a top stitch, and then that will be it. That will be the collar attached. So There it is, it's all pinned up. I have tucked in those sneaky little edges so that they'll get captured as well by the stitch. And all that's left for me to do is sew it up, and then I've got my collar done. And that's it with the collar sewn up. So once you've done that, that's it, you've done your collar. I hope you found this tutorial useful. As I mentioned, I've also previously run a tutorial on how to draft your own collar, so feel free to watch that if you want to know how to design your own. But yeah, if you have any questions, then feel free to ask.